The more openly you feel, the less safely you are known. That should not be true. Everything you have been taught says it is not true. Openness builds trust. Honesty invites closeness. The people who share freely are the ones who connect deeply, and the people who hold back are the ones who stay lonely, misunderstood, circling their own interior without ever letting anyone in. That is the story, and for a long time it holds. Until you notice something. A conversation that shifted the room in a way you did not intend. A confidence that traveled further than you expected. A version of yourself, honest, open, unguarded, being quietly filed away and used as evidence of something you never meant to confess. You were not performing, you were not manipulating, you were simply telling the truth about how you felt. And somehow, that is what made you easier to underestimate. The contradiction does not resolve cleanly. It just sits there, asking something harder than most people are willing to ask, not whether your feelings are real, but whether the act of sharing them always serves you. Whether honesty and exposure are the same thing, whether the relief of speaking is the same thing as wisdom. They are not. And that gap, small, quiet, almost invisible, is where everything in this episode lives. She had always been the kind of person people described as real. Not in a performance, just genuinely open. When something bothered her, she said so. When she felt unappreciated, she named it. When anxiety crept in before a big meeting, she would mention it to a colleague, almost casually, as if saying it out loud would take away some of its power. For a long time, this felt like health. She had read enough to know that suppression was dangerous. She had seen what happened to people who kept everything inside. She was not going to be that person. She worked in a mid-sized company, the kind of place where relationships mattered, where being liked was not everything, but it was not nothing either. She was good at her job, thoughtful, consistent. She cared about the people around her. But over the past year, something had started to shift in ways she could not quite name. A promotion she had expected went to someone else, someone she had, more than once, confided in about her frustrations with management. She did not connect those things immediately. They seemed separate. Then there was the team meeting where she had mentioned, honestly and without drama, that she felt overlooked on a recent project. She thought the transparency would invite a conversation. Instead, the room got careful, quiet in the way rooms get when people are recalibrating. She noticed her manager looking at her differently after that, not unkindly, just with more distance, as if something had been noted. A few weeks later, she shared with a work friend that she was feeling burned out, that the pace was unsustainable, that she was seriously thinking about what staying long-term would mean for her. It was a real conversation. She felt heard in the moment. By the end of the month, there were rumors, small ones, ambient, that she was unhappy and might be looking elsewhere. She had no idea how that impression had formed. She had not exaggerated anything. She had not complained maliciously. She had simply been honest about her interior life, the way she had always been with people she thought were safe. She sat with that for a long time. The confusion of having done nothing wrong and still finding herself standing in a different position than she had started. Something had shifted. She could not identify exactly when. Only that the world she thought she was sharing herself with had been taking notes she had not intended to give. Step outside the story for a moment. Underneath her behavior was a belief so natural it had never been examined, so quietly held that it did not feel like a belief at all. It felt like common sense. The kind of thing you absorb in families, in friendships over years, until it becomes indistinguishable from how you think things simply are. The assumption was something like this: sharing what I feel creates connection, and through connection, safety. She was not naive. She was not careless. She understood that suppression caused harm. She had watched other people carry their feelings in silence for years and come apart slowly at the seams. She had decided consciously that she would not do that. But there was something missing from the belief itself, something it had never been asked to account for. It treated emotion as a kind of private currency, something that only grew in value when exchanged. As if the act of sharing was the point, regardless of where it landed or who was receiving it. The assumption said, feelings want to be released. It said nothing about where they land once they leave you. It said nothing about what other people do with them. It said nothing about the distance between what you intend when you speak and what is actually received. She had been operating as if the internal experience of honesty, that clean, relieved feeling of having said the true thing, was identical to its external effect, as if sincerity guaranteed safety. But those are two entirely different things. The feeling is private, the words are not. Once emotion becomes language, it leaves the controlled environment of your interior life and enters a space governed by completely different rules, other people's interpretations, their interests, their relationships with people you have never met. The feeling was yours. The words once spoken are not. That was the crack not in her character, but in the assumption she had inherited without question. This kind of assumption does not form in isolation. There is an entire cultural architecture built around the premise that emotional openness is inherently good, that vulnerability is strength, that the willingness to be seen, truly seen, including the difficult parts, is what separates people who are growing from people who are stuck. Self-help has built an industry on this idea. The books, the podcasts, the language of emotional intelligence, all of it oriented toward the same directive: feel more, share more, hide less. The progression is presented as linear. Openness leads to connection. Connection leads to belonging. And in the right settings, with the right people, that progression is real. Workplace culture has absorbed this language without always examining it carefully. The vocabulary of psychological safety and bringing your whole self to work entered corporate spaces with good intentions, but those ideas were designed to protect people from fear-based silence, from institutional cruelty that punishes honesty. They were not designed to dissolve the distinction between a therapist and a manager, between a trusted friend and a competitive colleague. That distinction got lost somewhere in translation. And so people, thoughtful, well-meaning people, began importing emotional norms from one context into another, speaking about their anxieties at work the way they might in a close friendship, naming vulnerabilities in professional settings where those vulnerabilities would be held not with care, but with the particular practicality of people who have deadlines and their own things to protect. There is also the simpler equation that lives inside most genuine friendships. The more I let you see, the closer we become. This is often true, but it does not transfer cleanly to every relationship. Not every person who seems warm is equipped to hold what you hand them. Not every colleague who asks how you are really doing is prepared to protect what you say next. Some are sympathetic in the moment but careless afterward. Some are operating inside an institution that has its own way of classifying information, and what you share will move through that system in ways you never intended. The cultural narrative around vulnerability rarely examines this side of the transaction. It focuses on the person sharing their courage, their growth, their willingness to be real. It almost never asks what happens to the information after it leaves, where it goes, what form it takes when it passes through channels that were not built to protect it. She was not failed by honesty. She was failed by the assumption that honesty and safety travel together automatically, that sincerity by itself is a form of protection. It is not, and the world she was operating in had never quite said so out loud. Niccolo Machiavelli was not writing about emotions. He was writing about power, about survival, about the persistent, sobering distance between what people intend and what actually unfolds in a world made of other people. He spent his years in Florence watching governments collapse and reform, watching men of principle lose to men of strategy, watching the gap between private virtue and public result open again and again with predictable consistency. And out of that watching, he arrived at a conclusion that made him permanently uncomfortable to read. Good intentions do not protect you. Understanding the environment does. One of his foundational observations was about perception, that the world does not respond to what you feel or even to what you are. It responds to what it perceives you to be. Perception is the actual medium of human interaction. You can be sincere and still be misread. You can be honest and still be made vulnerable by that honesty, depending on who receives it and under what conditions. He did not regard this as cynical. He regarded it as honest, brutally, usefully honest. He also believed that self-possession, the deliberate management of what you reveal and when, was not deception. It was intelligence, because it required you to be honest with yourself about the environment you were actually in, rather than the idealized one you might prefer to be in. Real strength for Machiavelli was not suppression and it was not performance. It was discernment, the ability to hold something fully inside yourself, to feel it completely, to understand it without requiring it to become visible. He wrote about leaders who could not manage their own expressions, whose faces and voices became transparent windows into whatever was happening inside them. Such people, he argued, handed others a permanent advantage. Those others would always know more about the leader than the leader knew about them. The information would flow in one direction, and whoever held more information held more power. This is not an argument for coldness. It is the recognition that emotion, once spoken aloud, moves beyond you. It enters a room. It becomes data. And data in the hands of other people, people with their own pressures and interests, is no longer entirely yours to control. The second idea Machiavelli might have offered is quieter, and it cuts a little deeper. He was suspicious of the impulse to discharge, to release internal pressure by externalizing it. The relief of speaking is real. When you say the difficult thing, the weight shifts, you feel lighter. That experience is genuine. But he would have drawn a careful distinction between relief and wisdom. The pressure moves out of you and into the air. What happens to it next is entirely outside your control. Sometimes what feels like emotional honesty is something simpler, pressure reduction, the need to not be alone with the feeling anymore. There is nothing wrong with that need. It is deeply human. But the need to release and the wisdom of releasing into a particular space at a particular moment are two different things. And treating the feeling of relief as confirmation that sharing was the right move, that is where things quietly go sideways. The question Machiavelli might have put to her was slow, patient. What happens to this feeling once it leaves you? Who holds it next, and what do they do with it? And if you could see that answer clearly, not ideally, but realistically, would you still make the same choice? Look at what she did through this lens, and it does not look like weakness. It does not look like too much feeling or too little restraint. It looks like miscalculation. Not the dramatic kind. The quieter kind, accumulating over months, one small disclosure at a time, until the landscape has shifted in ways that are hard to trace back to any single moment. She brought real feelings into spaces that were not designed to hold them. Not because the people around her were malicious, most were not, but because the environment had its own internal logic, and that logic had nothing to do with protecting her interior life. It was a workplace, a network of professional relationships inside an institution that ran on information, on reputation, on perception. Every time she mentioned anxiety before a meeting, she was handing someone a detailed map of her uncertainty. Every time she named her frustration, she was drawing a border around her limits and giving that border to someone who had not been asked to guard it. Every time she spoke about feeling overlooked, she was allowing other people to define what that meant and to decide, quietly, what should be done about it or left undone. None of this required bad intentions. That is what makes it so difficult to see clearly. It was not calculated against her. It was quieter than that, almost administrative. Information circulates inside organizations the way water moves through a landscape, finding the path of least resistance, arriving in places no one planned for it to reach. The intentions of the person who released it are irrelevant to the path it takes. She had been operating as if the people around her were built to hold confidences. But they were colleagues, fully human, managing their own anxieties and professional interests. They received what she said and processed it through their own framework, and those categories did not look like hers. The shift in perception is not from openness to closure, not from honesty to performance. It is something more specific. Moving from an automatic assumption, sharing creates safety, to a deliberate question. What is this space? What is this relationship? What happens to this feeling once it leaves me? In the second version of herself, she is not hiding. She is simply choosing, from awareness rather than reflex, what she makes visible and why and to whom. That is not a loss of authenticity. It is its fullest expression. There is something worth sitting with here before moving on. Because this is the kind of realization that can tip in two directions, and the wrong direction leads somewhere bleak. The wrong direction sounds like people cannot be trusted, feelings should be kept inside, emotional openness was always naive. That is not what this is. The thing to sit with is quieter. It is the recognition that feelings and the expression of feelings are two entirely separate events. That one does not automatically produce the other. That the gap between them, the space where you make a choice, is not a space of shame. It is a space of agency. Most people were never taught that the gap exists. They were taught that the healthy thing was to move feeling quickly into expression. That hesitation meant avoidance. That withholding meant repression. That the person who spoke freely was the one doing the work. This is not entirely wrong. Genuine suppression causes real damage. But there is a vast territory between suppression and immediate disclosure. A whole interior landscape most people never develop because they were never shown it. In that territory, feelings are felt completely. not managed away, felt with their full weight, and then held, considered, understood from the inside before being carried anywhere else. This is not the same as not feeling. It is a deeper relationship with feeling because you are no longer outsourcing the experience to whoever happens to be nearby. You are staying with it long enough to understand what it is actually telling you. She was not broken. Nothing about her emotional life needed to be fixed. What needed to change was the automatic connection between feeling and speaking, the reflex that treated disclosure as relief and relief as wisdom. The space between them, the moment where you choose whether to carry something quietly or bring it into a shared space, is not empty. It is where self-possession lives. Those two things had been fused for her, feeling and sharing, merged into a single motion, automatic, unreflective. Quietly, without drama, they needed to come apart. Not because feeling is dangerous, but because she deserved to be the one who decided what happened to hers. Oversharing is not about saying too much. It is about forgetting that once a feeling becomes a sentence, it no longer belongs entirely to you. There is a kind of self-possession that does not announce itself. It does not wear the face of detachment. It does not perform restraint the way some people perform warmth. It does not build a wall between itself and others, or signal its presence through silence or distance or careful vagueness. It simply knows the difference between what it feels and what it chooses to make visible. And it holds those two things separately, not with effort after a long time, but with the quiet confidence of someone who has learned that their interior life belongs to them. This is not the same as coldness. Cold people do not feel much. What is being described here is something different, the experience of feeling something fully, staying with it long enough to understand it, and then deciding from a place of clarity rather than pressure what to do with it, where to take it, whether to take it anywhere at all. Some feelings arrive to tell you something. They are information. They point to something worth examining, a value being violated, a boundary being crossed, a need that has gone unmet. Those feelings deserve attention. They deserve to be understood from the inside before they are carried anywhere else. Some feelings arrive simply as weather, pressure that builds and wants to move. The instinct is to release them, to find someone, anyone, who will hold them for a moment while you get your breath back. That instinct is human. There is nothing wrong with it. But the release does not always have to be spoken. And when it is spoken, the destination matters. The feelings are still real. They still carry the full weight of everything that generated them. Nothing about sitting with them quietly diminishes what they are. They simply do not always need an audience to be true. And there is something steadying about knowing that, about understanding that your emotional life does not require external confirmation to be valid, that you are allowed to feel something privately, completely, and then decide with clear eyes and no urgency what happens next. That is not distance from yourself. That is the closest you can get.